look at the TV and look at everyone shouting at each other and war, right? All of this stuff is just everyone like saying, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. Like,
But you are right, Andrew, so it's
well,
okay.
And welcome to Dregs of Wisdom with Andrew Tanner.
hey everyone, this is episode 18 of Dregs of Wisdom. Today's episode is about spiritual wisdom for a world on fire. I have a very special episode today. We have two guests. First, if you've been with the Dregs for a while, you'll know Chris Berlin. He is an instructor in spiritual counseling and Buddhist ministry at Harvard Divinity School. He also teaches classes on enlightenment, mindfulness, and compassion in Harvard Extension School, where he won an award this year for being one of the most outstanding teachers at the Extension School, which I can attest to as a former student. And then we have Thomas Richardson, who is also an M.Div. He is a licensed acupuncturist, meditation teacher, and Taoist scholar, author of Extraordinary Chinese Medicine and Neoclassical Pulse Diagnosis. So why are we having this conversation today? Well, it turns out that, Chris and Thomas were having a chat. And guys, you mentioned to me that you were having this really interesting chat with everything going on in the world, with the war in Gaza, the protests on college campuses, the war in Ukraine. It's like we're in a world on fire. And so tell us about your conversation. What prompted this, and why do you think it'd be interesting for people to hear about it today?
I can go and welcome everyone, and it's good to see you, Andrew and Thomas, my brother. It's good to see you. I think one thing that our conversation when Thomas and I were talking, and we frequently have these conversations where we'll just sort of join kind of our hearts and our consciousness, and then things begin to emerge out of the conversation that both of us are holding in terms of how we see both spirituality personally and also in the world. And these are conversations that you just don't hear very often, especially, I think, in the midst of all of the rhetoric and all of the media and the social media sound bites. There is so much, and there is information and there's misinformation. And in the midst of all of it is tremendous suffering, tremendous separation. So I feel like, what we really need is almost a transmission for people to have sort of a much more spacious view of where we are in the ages as we're unfolding. How might we actually navigate these times in ways that are helpful as opposed to contributing to what feels like insanity in the world? And so I think, how we talk about these things really matters. And bringing practice, bringing our our deepest intentions and the consciousness and the progress on whatever path we're on into these conversations, it has never been more important than right now.
Yeah, I think of spiritual traditions as often practices for one's own self-realization, right? And then religion is similar. A lot of religion is about, just depending on the religion, of course, but it's more of doing that in a community. But I think what you're pointing to is that there are within the Eastern spiritual traditions, so Buddhism, Taoism, I think we're going to talk about those two. We'll probably talk a little bit about some Hindu thought as well around the yugas. There are these ideas about how to see what time we're in the world. And even in Christianity, and Judaism, there's a season for every thing under heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that reflection is what we're really focused on, is not looking at how do I kind of make myself better as a spiritual person, but how do we see what time we're actually in? Is that the gist of the conversation you were having? And I'm curious, Thomas, what thoughts do you have around that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Andrew, for having me on as well. And it's just an honor to be here with both of you. So Thank you very much. And yeah, what both of you have said, I think, is so true that the times we live in, it's easy to get caught up in what in Chinese medicine they sometimes will term an internal urgency, where there's just all of this energy and there can be this strong impetus to feel the need to do something. And I think that oftentimes that urge to do something will be coming from fear rather than a place of love and groundedness and clarity and wisdom. And so sometimes having a little bit broader macro view of how the current moment fits into a greater cycle can create the spaciousness for each of us individually to step back a little bit and find that place of peace within us that can then allow us to move forward in our actions and words out in the world in a way that is more skillful and can maybe bring greater peace and benefit to others rather than contributing to the suffering. Because a lot of times we don't realize that even if we have what we believe to be a good intention in trying to change the world in a certain way or to make it be a way that we think it should be, often that actually contributes to greater suffering.
Totally. And I think most people see that when you just look at the TV and look at everyone shouting at each other and war, right? All of this stuff is just everyone like saying, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. Like,
But you are right, Andrew. So it's
well,
okay.
well, aren't we all just more
I
right than
agree.
everyone else who's fighting? I mean, that's what we're doing here, right? We're just saying how much more right we three are than everyone else. But okay, let's explore why we are more right than everyone else.
Well, now we need to just work our way out of this rabbit hole that we're in about us being right. Because you know what? It's one thing Thomas said on our conversation that really stuck with me was that for many people, it's more important to be right than it is to have peace.
Hmm.
And I don't know, Thomas, if you want to expand on that, but I found that was such an insightful, um, yeah, an insightful point to make about part of what we're seeing out there among all the voices going back and forth.
Yeah, so I know that we're going to touch on this later when we get more to talking about cycles, but in Buddhism, they often say that we live in degenerate times. And part of the manifestation of that degenerateness that we are immersed in is that humans tend to be much more egotistical, more narcissistic, and there's less humility than there would be at other times when there's more peace and enlightenment. And so, where that arises from is this attachment to self. And so, really, that degenerateness is a sign of the materialism of the times. And when I say materialism, I mean it in the broadest possible context of attachment to form,
Mm-hmm.
attachment to appearances, attachment to the ego, which is the sense of self, a sense of an individuated self that is somehow reified, and we believe it to be concrete and permanent, instead of realizing that we are all impermanent, continually changing beings that have the ability to grow and evolve, and that ultimately, while we exist in these individuated bodies for a period of time and have a sense of self and other, ultimately we are all connected to an underlying unity that we are always a part of and never separate from. And so, to come back to this point, when we get this attachment collectively to the sense of self, to the ego, then we become more concerned with being right, because being right is almost like it's like a survival level issue, because it's related to our very sense of self. Our opinions are who we are. And so when Chris and I were talking, one of the things that I said was just that because of all this attachment to self, so often people are more attached to being right than to actually wanting peace. And so the underlying intention is what's most powerful. And so until people start to want peace more than they want to be right, we won't have peace.
And if I can pick up on that thread, as you mentioned, Thomas, the survival mode that we're in. When I look at what we can call sort of the collective shadow that we're in at this age, we're no longer supposedly in the Kali Yuga in the Hindu tradition, but we are in an ascension part moving into the next age, an age that actually can be quite potentially auspicious. Now, that looks different in Buddhism a little bit, because as Thomas said, in Buddhism, we're still in this degenerated age. But what does that really look like collectively in our psyche? And what I see happening is a tremendous shadow of powerlessness that is like a blanket through our hearts, through our minds. And even more so, to Thomas's point about survival mode, we are in fight, flight, freeze. We're in just that basic amygdala process. And in some cases, rightfully so. If you're experiencing bombs dropping around you, what else can you possibly do, right? If you're feeling an existential threat somehow through aggression and violence, how else are you going to feel? I mean, this is natural, biochemistry and brain science. This is what has helped us survive. That I don't see that reaction as the problem, but it's when things get maladaptive, from a psychological standpoint, where the narratives start to feed a chronic continuum of fight, flight, freeze, and maybe fawn. Although that's I don't know that that's really so much part of this what we're talking about. And so this powerlessness is showing up as anger, hatred, aggression, the rightness that Thomas is talking about, this need for certainty and solidarity. That too is natural. I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing is natural, but the tipping point doesn't seem to be making change quickly enough, whether it's the environment or the places in the world where you have authoritarian or nationalistic governments that are oppressing others through their own fear, through their own victimization. It's just this negative feedback loop. It's a positive feedback loop, but it's very negative. And so we're in a collective fight, flight, or freeze period of time, and we've been there for a long time. It's just, I think, coming to a tipping point. And for some people, not for all, it has to get so bad that they just see the futility in trying to maintain power or control or aggression.
It's interesting to point at the specific time that we're in right now. And you mentioned the yugas. There's different ideas about the yugas. For those who don't know what the yugas are, the yugas are these ages. And in traditional Hindu philosophy, and when I say Hindu, I mean various religions from India, some say that the ages, like the Kali Yuga, age of Kali is like the age of destruction, the age of darkness, and that it could last for 2 million years, according to some scholars. But why we in our emails back and forth, I was talking about Sri Yukteswar, who is Paramahansa Yogananda's teacher. So if you've heard of Paramahansa Yogananda, he was a pretty famous yogi in early 1900s. He spoke at Harvard, I think at the world religious organizations. He was kind of bringing Hindu thought or yogic thought to the West. And he was really interested in linking together yoga and Judeo-Christian traditions, actually. But his teacher, and he wrote many books, Autobiography of a Yogi, et cetera, et cetera. His teacher, Sri Yukteswar, you can see pictures of this guy. He just emanates, you got to love this guy. I don't know. He's got an energy that you feel something from him. He only wrote one book. It's It's called The Holy Science. It's a very thin little book. I left it at my house, unfortunately, but and he only talks about the yugas for 12 pages. But basically what he says is that in the beginning of this past Kali Yuga, they messed up all the dates and numbers because so many books were burned, so many scrolls were, and if you look at, it wasn't just the Library of Alexandria that got burned, in the 3rd century. There was major book burning in China and Asia. There were major book burnings in the Middle East. There was a lot of destruction of knowledge. And he said that the actual time for the Kali Yuga is 2,400 years, and that we left the Kali Yuga around 1900. And the next yuga is called the Dwarapa Yuga, which is the age where we go from total darkness, total materialism, to an age where we start to understand how energy works. And that would be, the beginning of like E equals MC squared, right? Einstein's kind of theories of relativity, the beginning of the understanding of energy coincides with this early 1900s period. And he also predicted that, I think you were alluding to this, Chris, there was like a 200-year transition period when you transition from one yuga to another. And during that transition period, this was from Sri Yukteswar, there's a lot of wars, there's a lot of violence, probably because change makes us feel powerless, feel scared. And it requires a jump in consciousness. The main shift in yugas is that when we change yugas, there's a collective jump in human consciousness, the ability for humans collectively to see the world in a different way. And that the yuga that we're currently in and ascending into is Dwarapa. I could talk a little, I don't want to go too deep into this stuff, but just to finish the yuga cycle, there's a 3rd yuga called Treta Yuga, which is where it's more of a psychic yuga. We go beyond energy and we start to fully understand the power of the mind. And then there's the Satya Yuga, the truth yuga, where we connect completely with spirit, and it's like a golden age. And according to Sri Yukteswar, the cycle of the yugas is around 24,000 years, which coincides scientifically. We know that the procession through the equinoxes takes 26,000 years. Some people who have read Sri Yukteswar's works, and Sri Yukteswar knew nothing about that kind of stuff. He was writing in the late 1800s. But people are saying it's possible that there is an acceleration of the planetary cycle, so that if our movement through the equinoxes was a constant, then it's 26,000 years. But if there's an acceleration and deceleration, it may in fact be around 24,000 years. So that's just a thing to throw in the mix of, there are these concepts of ages. And I would love to hear from the two of you, both the Buddhist side and the Taoist side, about what age are we in, and how do we understand this transition?
Well, I can speak certainly a bit to the Buddhist side, and then maybe we'll hand it over to Thomas to see what, perhaps what the Taoist view is. But another point, just to add, Andrew, to what you're talking about, is how important for me it is as a human being in this place and time, caught up in this mix, right? The samsaric mix, is that, number one, we're not talking about, of course, a linear path, or what we call at divinity school an eschatology, meaning that we're going in a straight line in our temporal reality towards some ultimate salvation down the road. But rather, what we're talking about with the yugas are these very long periods of circular time, these yuga chakra, or these wheels, the cosmic wheel or the cosmic eras. And yet, even within the circular process, we're never in the same place twice. We're never in the same place twice. This is an important part, I think, for all of us to kind of be able to continue to stay devoted and committed to some kind of spiritual practice and our own evolution. We're not just running in circles and coming back to the same starting point. This is my insight, or my opinion anyway. But rather, we're on a spiral. And, we could bring into the conversation free will, choice. We can really get into the weeds with some of those things. But the point being that we actually do have some agency in the world to evolve. We have to choose. We have to make the choice to do this. If we don't choose to evolve, we're going to keep evolving, certain parts of our collective projections, like technology and everything, to sort of a destructive point, even to the point of destroying our ecosystem, our biosphere. So we have to make some choices too and provide guidance on this path. But the point here is that we want the spiral to be going in a way where there is evolution, not just repeating just the same things, because that too has a shelf life for human beings. The cosmos is just as it is. It's cause and effect, right? But Andrew, you mentioned intelligence or truth. And that's one of the things that, as human beings, as practitioners, as well as people stuck in samsara, is to be able to learn from these, what we could call degenerated ages, to gain more wisdom, right? Collectively or communally, even better. And there are these two terms. Collective means we have a lot of disparate, separate people, individuals, who don't see their interconnectedness. But communally means we recognize the unity in this evolution that we are ultimately seeking through wisdom, and not just through technical prowess and power. So from a Buddhist view, yes, we are still in a degenerated age. And there are varying views of this. 10,000 years is one sort of more common in the Mahayana tradition view of where we are. And we're just starting this 10,000 year period. It's interesting also to think about what comes next. This figure of Maitreya Buddha, the Buddha of the future, who will come to basically restore the principles of Dharma into this sort of golden age of wisdom and love. Maitreya, Maitri is based on Maitri, which is loving kindness, or metta in the Pali. So he is really this being of love. And yet some of us see this in the form not of an actual deity who will come and save us, but out of community, out of a communal approach, communal wisdom, by sort of doing what we're doing today, which is joining our wisdom, our hearts, and looking at what it is that really can help the path bring us a greater sense of freedom and peacefulness, which is what everybody, I think, aspires for on some level, whether they know it or not. So from a Buddhist view, the present age of this sort of degenerated period really is characterized by war, violence, ignorance, delusion, as well as certainty that the delusions are real. So we start taking delusional thinking as being real. And then, as if that's not bad enough, we have this need to reify these delusions as if they are objective, or as if they are rational, when in fact, they're just delusional. So that's part of it, I think, is to be able to see our own projections, our own narratives, to be able to see past them into and beyond sides into what is kind of the non-dual way through a conflict. What really will help here between these sides? And usually there are two sides. It is very dualistic. It's interesting. You don't see like five sides around an issue in general. You know, I would love to see that, because then there would be a recognition that there is more than just black or white, good and bad, you know. But we're not in an age of nuance where nuance is trusted. And so I think that tends to polarize us even more into, as Thomas mentioned, you know, being right as opposed to being, committed to peacefulness. So anyway, I could keep going, but I would love to hear from Thomas.
Yeah. Thomas, what are your thoughts, brother?
Oh my goodness, there's so much that's already been shared. Um, there's a couple things I'd just like to touch on before I go more into the Taoist cosmology and their viewpoint. When you were talking about the transition between the yugas, Andrew, and the tumultuousness of that transition, it made me think of how that's often the case with transitions and what can be termed liminal spaces, when we've left one way of being, but we haven't yet fully moved into the next way of being. And there's a lot of unknown in liminal spaces and liminality. And it can be terrifying. And it brings up that fear that makes us strive for, the desire to have a right and a wrong, and a black and a white, and good and bad, and everything very clear cut. And so often it's easy as humans to try to rush to grab onto one thing as the right answer. But the beauty of liminality and the growth that can come out of liminal spaces and transitions really occurs when you allow yourself to open to the unknown, and you create the spaciousness to not grab onto one way being the right way. And part of the reason I bring this up is to touch on a little bit what Chris was saying, is in these spaces there is the ability to have a lot of beauty come forth, and a lot of peacefulness, and a lot of wisdom. And at the same time, I think it's important to allow that not everybody has to be some certain way all the time. And that while we are collectively moving in a certain direction, each individual is also on their own path and at their own point of growth, and has different things that they need at different times. And so allowing that, people or philosophies or perspectives that we might think are not necessarily healthy or skillful or beneficial, that might just be where those people need to be at that point in time for lessons that they need to learn. Because while it does bring greater suffering, I don't know that suffering is ever without a purpose. And that ultimately suffering has the ability to cause us to surrender once we've gone through enough. It can cause us to let go of that attachment to needing to be some certain way or needing to be right, and allow us to surrender to something greater than our limited individuated selves. So to build
Is
on,
suffering really the problem? I mean, won't there be suffering in every age, and also the possibility of enlightenment in every age?
yeah, I think so. And right now, I think part of what contributes to the darkness of the age that we're in right now is that we tend to demonize suffering. And we try to avoid it, and we try to avoid suffering and death at all costs, rather than accepting it as part of the deal of being living embodied human beings. And I think that in modern society, we too often conflate comfort with happiness, whereas comfort is an absence of suffering, whereas happiness is more of a fullness of life and working with reality as it is. And that entails being open to suffering and using suffering as an opportunity to grow. Because the interesting thing about our experiential capacity is that we cannot selectively shut down our ability to experience. And so if we shut down experiences of suffering, we equally shut down our ability to experience pleasure and joy and happiness.
In a way, it's a paradox, right? And we're not talking about two wooden structures on a beach. Sorry, bad joke. Paradox. Anyway, we're talking about
Wow. That
Sorry, Andrew.
was
Okay, we can
called
stop
out
now if you really
level.
want to. No, but I mean, I think what Thomas is getting at as well is that how important it is to embrace paradox in suffering and freedom. Yeah, it's because we're still, as he says, we're still caught up in this dualistic mindset of happiness and misery, freedom, ignorance, and all of these things. So I think if we can embrace what is an apparent paradox, there is no real paradox, but it's a paradox is just sort of a mental formation that can't reconcile two truths, right? And it's limited to reason. But I think seeing our full humanity, seeing all of us, that as you say, Andrew, there are always going to be periods of suffering and opportunities for awakening. I think that's true, and yet there are certain forms of suffering happening right now that I think wisdom can actually help alleviate. And what comes up for me is the Buddha's two arrows. Yes, there will always be suffering due to the fact that we are fallible. We're in these fragile human bodies, sickness, death. Of course, the truth of impermanence causes that. And yet, despite that truth, how we relate to that, how we relate to samsara, there are things possible. We know that with our children in elementary schools, that the more we teach them mindfulness or how to self-regulate their emotions, just simple things like that, you actually can make a difference in an entire classroom. Teaching them how to be optimistic as opposed to pessimistic or aggressive. Um, there is still a lot we can do to ease that second arrow on a communal, collective level.
I want to ask a question to the both of you that I think is on really everyone's mind, because I think one of the biggest sources of suffering right now is the right and wrong teams between, Democrats, Republicans, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine. Like, I think people are living in trying to make heads or tails of the paradox of what it's like to live in a global world where we're part of a superpower. We're all just villagers in this global superpower, right? And we don't, we have connections though around the world because of technology. And what advice do you give to someone who is struggling to understand their role? Because I think that what all the anger and fighting is about, people trying to say, well, what's my role? What's my dharma? What's my purpose in all this? And then maybe just choosing a side, right? On any number of issues, or saying, I want to ignore that. And I'm curious, where do you two land on that? Maybe Thomas, you go first, and
Yeah,
Chris.
thank you. So it is a complex thing, and as Chris was saying, there isn't a lot of room for nuance now, or paradox, or complexity. And that's part of it, is to allow ourselves to grow to see a bigger picture. And ultimately, the way I look at it, and by no means do I think that I am necessarily right. I know that I still have a lot to learn, and the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. And yet, from my experience at this point in time, what I would say is that part of what occurs in this time that we're in, because of the discussion we had earlier about the attachment to form and sense of self, is that we often define ourselves by what we are fighting against. And that's part of what perpetuates these divisions. And often, everyone has an ideal. We have an ideal within us of how we think the world should be, or how we think others should be, or what would be the ideal community or world. And so often we go about trying to make this ideal happen in the outer world. But ultimately, the true power that we have is to cultivate that ideal within ourselves. And when we cultivate that ideal within ourselves, it will naturally flow out from us and begin to impact others and the world around us. So while there are these sides in many different levels and realms that are fighting against each other, I would say that ultimately the greatest fight, the only true fight that we have, is the fight within ourselves, for that separation that we have from the underlying unity. And when we bring that fight within and we learn to cultivate that peacefulness within, rather than trying to force the outer world to be some certain way, then we end up affecting the world and affecting change without trying to impose our will on the world, without trying to change the world in a specific way.
But so should the protesters go home and start a meditation practice, or what?
So I don't know that I have the place to say what anybody else should do. What I think is more important is that each person understand where the underlying intention is coming from for anything that they say or do. And I think there is a place where people can peacefully work towards change in the outer world collectively. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh was an amazing example of that. But part of what he did, to my understanding, is he really encouraged the people that were following him to really turn the gaze within and to continually come back to a peaceful place within themselves and make sure that their actions and words came from that place. Because if we aren't very aware and careful, it's so easy to get caught into being reactive. And ultimately, that's the root of all violence.
I wonder, are there Buddhist spiritual teachers leading protest movements today? And I mean, we talk about Thich Nhat Hanh, we talk about Martin Luther King, Gandhi, all of these nonviolent protests. I don't know who the leaders of protest movements are now, and whether spiritual leaders are not part of that. And I'm speaking from ignorance. So, Chris, I'm curious. You can respond to that, or what would you say? What do you tell the students at Harvard about this? That asks you, hey, do you think I
Yeah.
should go and spend time at the protest, or should I?
Mm-hmm.
What should I do? What would you say
Yeah.
to them?
That's a great question, and I feel like it's a yes and to what Thomas was sharing, because I think he's absolutely right that we have to be self-aware. There has to be an understanding of the motivation, and I think that in many ways there is a dimension of the protesters around the world now that has matured into a place where they're recognizing the importance of not reacting when the police come and start tearing it down, or in UCLA when some of the counter protesters were throwing fireworks into the encampment, is to just, because there is an awareness. If you start reacting and you start getting violent, the whole thing becomes less legitimate in many ways. And so what I've seen is everything sort of on all sides. The most productive thing I've seen are people who are coming together in these encampments. And I don't have an opinion about the encampments. That's the other thing. If you don't have an opinion about it, you often will get ostracized. I had a conversation
Well,
with a
that
friend
means you
recently.
agree with the other side. If you don't have an opinion, Chris,
Exactly,
fuck you.
exactly,
You agree with the
exactly.
bad guys,
I think that it's a
whoever those
tool.
are.
It's a tool, right? And
Right.
it gets a lot of media attention and so on, and that's part of the idea. And yet, within some of those tents, have been deep conversations between people who are of Palestinian or Muslim descent. Muslim isn't really an ethnic thing as much as it is a sort of a spiritual ethnic context, and Jewish students having peaceful dialogue, conversations about the hard problem. And this doesn't get reported. This doesn't get reported. But there's work being done in some of those encampments.
Mm.
There is also a lot of anger and a lot of narrative that can be extremely destructive on all sides, inside and outside. And so part of my message, I think, on the ground here is, again, to Thomas's point, that it's so important to bring your awareness, your spiritual attunement into the protest and hold to it assiduously, and not with righteous indignation necessarily, but with the recognition of interdependence. Because when one person drops a bomb in one part of the world, unconsciously that has a ripple effect, just like dropping a pebble into a pond through our collective consciousness. Or when one person goes into sort of a peaceful community and wreaks havoc or murders people, that has a ripple effect. Nothing good can come from that. Again, it's the reactive amygdala on a collective level going, hey, this is an existential threat. We need to do something. That too is a narrative. And yet that, if that's as far as it goes, we're really in trouble. So there needs to be that middle way that says, okay, if we're going to reconcile this, we need to move beyond polarities. Whose job is that? It's everyone's, in my opinion. Because you can have a tremendous amount of anger at injustice, and yet if that's the end of the story, in Buddhism, there's this notion that if you're living from anger, it's like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. And so part of it is what do we do with this anger? And this is where Vajrayana Buddhism in particular says, let's deconstruct it a little bit, but harness the rawness of the energy, what we call fierce compassion, which is, we're not trying to eradicate the anger. Good luck with that. The more you try to eradicate it, the more aggressive it becomes. So, but what we do want to do is separate the narrative of hatred and destruction and just harness the raw clarity and the rawness of that for wisdom. It's a powerful, potent energy that can also bring wisdom. And that's what fierce compassion is. It doesn't rob anybody of their dignity, because that's part of the narrative of hatred and destructiveness. But rather, it says this does not work for you or for me. It doesn't work for us. I'm planting a boundary here, but I'd like to work with you on a solution that goes beyond just the fight or flight or freeze mentality. And so part of that is fierce compassion or using wrathful energy, but directing it into unity, not into further separation. There can be a deep commitment to that. I think some of the people that I've known, that are committed to this actually make more headway. If you think about civil rights, the protest in the 60s that led to the civil rights, was it the fighting? Was it the aggression that caused the change? No. It may have caused a stir in media attention. But, there were pictures of hippies putting flowers in the barrels of rifles, the peaceful protesting. And it was people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who addressed these problems from the spiritual view, from the view of dignity, of humanity, the spiritual view, from his Christian understanding and from his understanding of Gandhi's teachings and so on. There was a lot going into this that was generative and seeking to unify people. So I think on the ground,
today.
It doesn't, does it? Yeah.
It doesn't feel that there's a similar, at least not a strong enough voice that I've heard that we could point to, right now, who's on either side, who's trying to lead us to a promised land. And I like to, whenever students ask me about this sort of thing, I usually bring up, I relate it a lot to the chakra system and where we feel powerlessness in our body, which I believe is experienced more like in the solar plexus region. And when we focus on things that are out of our control, this region of our body starts to tighten up, like our breathing gets constricted, our digestion gets constricted, etc. When we focus on things that are in our control, and this is as simple as like a kid learning piano, if you give them the most Beethoven, when they're 5 years old, they hate it. But if you teach them hot cross buns, they feel a sense of accomplishment because that's what makes sense for them to work on. And when you're in a powerful place, it's when you are dealing with things that are within your sphere of control, or your sphere of influence. But when you focus on things that are way out of your control, and where all of society is focused on things that are so far out of our control, it is like a massive punch to your gut of disempowerment. Because the more you focus on things you can't control, it's like someone saying you're going to give a performance of Beethoven in front of 1,000 people and you've never learned piano before. And so I usually tell people to focus on their what they can control, which is themselves first, and then to be okay with not having to pick a side. I think both of you have touched on that, how important that is. I think if anything, I'll die on that sword. Like, the message for people is it's okay to not be on a side until you've done the work that you want to do in this. And if you're not willing to do that work because for many reasons, then in a way you stay out and you watch the war unfold. And that will have its own karma, one way or the other. I'm curious, Thomas, what the Taoist, we had never touched on the Taoist view. We've gotten a lot about from the Buddhist perspective. Do you want to give us a little of the Taoist thought?
So I'm going to speak about it more generally, not in terms of specific ages, but in the Tao Te Ching, there's a verse that I'm sure you're familiar with, Andrew, that the Tao gave birth to one gave birth to two gave birth to the 10,000 things. And it basically, well, two gave birth to three, and then three gave birth to,
birth
yes,
to the myriad things. Okay,
yes. My apologies.
that's
I
okay.
was getting ahead of myself in my thoughts, but so this basically lays out an understanding of Taoist cosmology of how all of manifest reality came into being. And so the Tao, the unity, I mean, we could call it a lot of things, but it's that all pervading unity that is always present, from which everything has arisen and to which everything will return. And to get from the Tao, so the Tao being complete unity can't actually experience itself, because if it was fully involved in experiencing, there would be nothing to experience. And if it was fully involved in being experienced, there would be nothing to do the experiencing. And so, and this concept is present in Sufism and a number of other traditions of how manifest reality came to be from the one being. But it's this idea that then, in order to have an experience, for consciousness to experience itself, it has to create these artificial divisions of discrete beings and things that can then perceive each other from a more limited viewpoint. And so basically, it's a movement from the unlimited to the limited so that we can have an experience of the unlimited, if that makes sense. And so the reason this is important is because this is a continuous cycle that happens. And part of what they use in Taoist meditation practices is you invert this process to move from the many back to the one. And so this is part of the origin of internal alchemy and alchemical practices. But it's also a process that's continuously occurring because it has to fold back into oneness to start the process over again. And so, on that view, if we were to work backwards from the many to the three to the two to the one to the Tao, this period that we're in is kind of like that duality. We were just talking a little bit ago about how there's not 5 perspectives. Everything that we're looking at, there's 2 very strong perspectives butting up against each other. And that could be this movement folding back into the oneness. We've got to go through that 2 to get to the 1, if that makes sense. But part of the reason I like these cycles that we talk about in more macro term, whether it's from the Buddhist perspective or the yugas in Hinduism, is it gives us just that spaciousness to realize that this is just a play of consciousness, that all the things that we're perceiving and experiencing are consciousness experiencing itself in infinite different ways and combinations. And so it's not that there's one certain way that the world is supposed to be, or that we as individuals or as humanity are supposed to be all the time, because that would be boring. That wouldn't give us the full experience of consciousness.
What I hear you saying, Thomas, is balance. That at the heart of this is maintaining balance. Is that accurate, you think?
Definitely. It's a continuous balance. And I think what we often lose sight of or don't realize is that no matter how out of balance things might seem in the world from our limited perspectives, on the whole is always in perfect balance because it's a perfect unity. And so if one area gets out of balance in one direction, a different area gets out of balance in the opposite direction. Because as a whole, it must always maintain perfect balance across the unity, otherwise it wouldn't be a unity. That's also, I would say, why bringing peacefulness within ourselves is one of the greatest things we can do, because if we're out of balance and we bring ourselves to a place of peace, that inherently means that somewhere else, some other equally opposite imbalance has also come to a place of peace.
And I think, Thomas, that points to this idea that people are stuck in a notion of, I'm pro-Israel or I'm pro-Ukraine or whatever it is, and the world has become small for them. They're not saying like, I'm one with all conscious beings, and therefore this whole thing is a farce. And I wonder for both of you, is the role of spiritual teachers and spiritual practices to help people have the realization, like the actual, not just the intellectual understanding, but the actual realization of their oneness? Is that what's missing? That people need to have that so that they can identify with something beyond. For example, Nikki Myers came on the show and she said, I'm a woman of color, I'm a former alcoholic, I am an alcoholic, I'm this and that, and I'm an MBA, I'm all her goods, all her bads. And then she says, and none of those define me. Because we go on to say we're actually this bigger thing, spirit for her, but for those of us that are studying the non-dual traditions, we are the Tao. Is that what people need? Chris, is that experience the thing that people are missing?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I cannot answer for other teachers. I know of a very prominent Buddhist teacher who came out very strongly, made a statement about that was very much on one side of the position of Israel and Gaza.
Can you just say the name of the teacher? If they've come out and said it, let's just name.
I'm not going to name the person. I'm not going to do that. But
okay, we'll have to
and that's not the point. Well, it's not the point, really. The point is, and here's my point, is that teachers are human beings. And we may all have opinions. We may have, in one part of us, we may have opinions. But when we are teaching, when we are in the role of teacher, I think our obligation is to apply the teachings. If we have an opinion, so be it. But part of that is applying the teachings in a way that's helpful, that's constructive, and not just throwing rhetoric or terms, incendiary words around. But again, I can't speak for the methodology, or if somebody is triggered and they're a Dharma teacher, we also have to we have to be able to allow for people's own humanity and emotional connection. Otherwise, we're spiritual bypassing. And there's a lot of that that can happen around these issues when so many people are suffering. So for me, it's always how do I bring this down onto the ground? Because suffering, even if the causes of the suffering aren't real, how do you say that to somebody whose relative is a hostage, or who lost their entire family in a bombing raid? It's such a luxury to have this conversation because none of us maybe are experiencing that. So that's, for me, it's like constantly reaching back and going, yes, and how does this help this person? What is the role of a Dharma teacher to make sense of what is ultimately insanity? And so I guess my message is one that I received from Leslie many years ago, my teacher Leslie. And I'll quote here something she says. She says, "Don't lose yourself at the expense of others. It means losing yourself to the insanity. Don't save yourself at the expense of others. It means creating the insanity." So I think to Thomas's point about beginning where you are with your own self-awareness, your own reflexivity, that is a quote that she made many years ago, that because we were having other problems then too in the world. And so it's so easy in these narratives, it's so easy in the suffering to lose ourselves and to become tribal in nature. And at that point, we've lost this sense of interconnection and interdependence. And again, it makes sense. This is how our brains are wired, to take care of ourselves. But it's not the end of the story. What happens, though, is what the Tibetans have a word called Shenpa. Shenpa means fixation, or being hooked or entrenched in dualistic thinking. And this, I think, is part of what we're talking about, trying to see what makes sense for teachers to bring into this conversation. How do we help make some clarity or bring some wisdom into the conversation so that there is a refuge for people who really genuinely want peace for themselves, their families? If this were an easy answer, it would have been done a long time ago.
Right.
So I feel like the role of a teacher is to speak to that. And to speak to it not from some intellectual narrative, but from the wisdom within the heart. And it involves empathy, it involves compassion, it also involves boundaries, it involves seeing the ecology out of which these things emerge. But I also feel very strongly that, like some of these conflicts that we're seeing, if we're going to try to solve a problem based on who is right from a historical standpoint, it will never end.
Right.
We need to
It'll end
begin
with
in the
love.
present moment. We need to begin in the present moment, look squarely at what we've inherited and what is happening, but then begin to move forward and see a way into the future. And I think that's what we're lacking right now, is a clear way forward. And so we're really stuck in this entrenchment in duality. And so teachers, in my opinion, need to speak to that dilemma.
I think the idea, like that you just said, of teachers offering a refuge and reminding people about the Dharma and reminding people their path, I think that's their role. I want to share two really interesting things about that. The first is that I know firsthand, because of my conversations with executives at different retreat centers and large spiritual organizations who have not taken a position on one way or the other on certain things. I think for a while, the idea that every spiritual organization had to take a position on every major thing, that was like in vogue from the mid 2010s through you know through COVID and everything in between, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, like the wars, etc. And I think what I'm sensing in my conversations with leaders right now is there's more openness to not taking a position. Now, that could be because they don't want to, because of power structures, but that just because that's not necessarily the best ethical reason why not to do that. I do think that the culture of organizations not having to take a position, if they're what they are teaching is spirituality, I'm actually pro that, um, personally.
Pro
And
what? What
I'm
is it?
pro the idea that organizations don't have to take a position.
Mm.
For example, now if I'm a spiritual organization that focuses on Israel, I imagine I have to have a position, or Palestine or whatever. But if I'm like a Buddhist teaching organization teaching in, mass in the Berkshires, do I need to have a position on a conflict, you know, that's happening in Israel, Palestine, just because I happen to exist in the country that is, supporting it? We're all interconnected, right? So does that mean we have to have a position on every conflict? For me, I think the job of the spiritual teacher is to remind people about the Dharma and what that position really is. Because that is the position of non-attachment and of seeing, like these battles that are going on, these wars that are going on, they're not done by people that are understanding the Dharma, right? They're being led by people obsessed with right versus wrong. And I think about, so the second thing I wanted to share is in the Bhagavad Gita, there's, it's right before, the Bhagavad Gita is happening right before a large battle. And before the Bhagavad Gita, in an earlier part of the Mahabharata, Krishna, Arjuna, who's the kind of the good guys in this narrative, he is trying to get certain people to fight on his side. And it's very similar to, if you've ever seen Game of Thrones, there were good people on both sides, but because of their honor, their duty, they have to fight, right? And at the end of the day, it turns out that Arjuna and his brothers have to fight against their own uncle and their own martial arts guru, who's fighting for the other side. That in this story is the side of darkness, or the side of not good side. And I almost wonder, is it the role of the spiritual teacher to, both remind people about the truth? So in the battle where Arjuna is actually fighting his martial arts teacher, the teacher is like trying to teach Arjuna like one final lesson about the Dharma, as opposed to actually trying to kill him. So we have these roles that we play. We may be Jewish, we may be Muslim, we may be whatever role that we have to play. And then there's also a greater role as a cosmic being, or one with everything. And I think, Chris, that I don't know, that's when you were sharing about this particular Dharma teacher that had a very specific view. I would almost wonder, was that view informed by the fact that they either have a strong connection to Israel, Palestine, or was it a more intellectual, like, this is what's right, this is what's wrong? Because I can understand the visceral view of, Pope John Paul, when he died, they read in his letters that at a certain point he had said, that if the USSR invaded Poland, he would lay down the staff of St. Peter and just go fight. So I'm curious. You don't have to out the teacher. I'm sure everyone's going to Google it after this anyways, but I know I will. But was their position more about their personal?
Yeah, it wasn't really about the teachings, and I can't speak on their behalf. But the way that I received it was that it was, as you say, visceral gut reaction, um, and was full of emotion and outrage. Um, but that was it. There was no other container for it.
Mm.
And I see that, like, using certain words, certain names, just perpetuate a process that is ultimately futile. There is a futility in aggressive opposition that will just go back and forth endlessly, as opposed to a utility of unity, of seeking that. It's interesting, as I was walking around the encampment in Harvard the other day, and it was pretty quiet. I think a lot of people were over at MIT, where there was a lot going on over there. But I had the thought of the story of the Buddha in his tent, and how one day Mara, kind of the demon, if you will, he's not really a demon in Buddhism. He's seen as the foil to wisdom. He's there to kind of help push the Buddha and force him to doubt his wisdom and doubt his awakening and all of that. And so you just see Mara in these different kind of as a nemesis to the Buddha's awakening. And one day Mara comes to the encampment of the Buddha, and Ananda, the Buddha's faithful attendant, is standing there. You almost have a sense he's guarding the Buddha in his tent. And he sees Mara and he goes, "Mara, what are you doing here? The Buddha doesn't want to see you. Why are you even here?" Right? And you just have this sense of like aggression. And Mara says, "Well, I'm here to see the Buddha. I want to talk to him." And the Ananda says, "No, go away. Go away. You're the bad guy." Right? And the Buddha hears Mara's voice. He hears this exchange, and he says, "Oh, is that Mara out there?
Yeah.
Tell him to come in. I'm just making tea. Let him sit here with me, and we'll have a conversation." And so Mara enters, and Ananda is just so frustrated. Mara enters the tent, sits down. They share tea, and then they start talking about all the old times they had in their struggles. But you have this sense of this spirit of like trying to seek truth together. And I thought about this as I was there, and it was, the encampment had been given a deadline, by the administration. You need to be out by this time, and so on. And I think it had passed that time, and so there was still nothing happening. But anyway, that came back to me as I was walking around there, and I thought, the spirit with which we engage, even though these are very grave situations for people who are dying, there's a lot of density to the suffering here. We need those teachings. We need the rootedness of that. The last thing too that I wanted to also mention, and I want to hand it over to Thomas, see if anything is coming up for him at this point, is there can be a tendency to imagine that this notion of freedom can only happen once things in the world are peaceful. Whether we're talking about the yugas, or we're talking about violence in the world in the present day, or we're talking about conscious evolution, there can be a tendency to want things to be, peaceful and quiet before we really engage in deeper introspection and contemplative practice leading to awakening. Mm. And one of the great Nyingma teachers, Longchenpa, has this poem called Freedom Attends Reality. He doesn't call it reality attends freedom for a reason. And so one of the things I developed a few years ago, during the pandemic, during the George Floyd protests, was people in our Sunday night community asking, what do I do with the reality of the world as it is? It's on fire, right? Literally. And so I took this to heart, and I developed the 7 stages of what I call freedom attending reality. And we went through each one every week. And basically it's on this premise that you can't wait for enlightenment to happen once everything is fine in the world, because it will never happen. But rather, we need to bring our progress, our cultivation, our realizations. We need to bring freedom into the world on fire. as opposed to the opposite.
Beautiful.
And I think we become placeholders, if you will, if nothing else, for the teachings. This is the importance of being a practitioner. And because one of the things I'm concerned about are people who say, well, if this is just the way it is, then I don't need to practice. Then why should I care about anything? And first of all, the circular thing not being in the same place twice, but spiral, there is something that is emerging, and it's easy to lose sight of this emergence that's happening collectively. It's very subtle, perhaps, but the reaction is very gross level. But we also need to be available, but either as placeholders for the teachings or as responders to offer guidance when we encounter suffering. It doesn't mean we go out necessarily looking for it and trying to make a difference or save everybody, because that too is full of attachment. But it's being fully present to all of it. Even like Thomas was mentioning, sort of alluding to the paradox, how there need to be those of us that are here to hold all of it. And if possible, offer some kind of transmission in the way that the great teachers have done in the past. Because enlightenment, for a long time, was a big part of the evolution of a student receiving a transmission of some kind. It's almost like, let's bring ourselves back to our original nature of basic goodness from a Buddhist view. And what that means is having confidence in your own spiritual power, but not an egoic confidence, but one that comes out of the motivation of love. But owning it, yeah? Having the confidence as what we're doing. I think that's why today's conversation is important. I think the three of us realize these are important conversations to have around what's going on in the world. And this is not I think I know all three of us really want peace. We want love. We want unity. And so the motivation needs to be pure from that place. And out of that, also transmitting with some confidence the teachings that maybe really can make a difference.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Thomas, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you say is spot on. And, talking about waiting for everything to be okay before, we pursue enlightenment. I actually think it's the opposite. I think that often suffering can be one of the greatest motivations to pursue practice. And it can actually be that which helps us to really dig deep within ourselves and examine ourselves. And as for the role of the spiritual teacher, I think that part of that role is to guide individuals where they are at. And for myself, I try to make broad, sweeping proclamations or judgments about groups or situations because I don't know that that ends up helping anyone. Ultimately, what we need is a perspective that can transcend and include both sides of any given paradigm. And it's only through having a perspective that is able to transcend both that we can then find some kind of resolution, true, meaningful, peaceful resolution. When I was actively practicing acupuncture and oriental medicine and running a clinic, there'd be so many times when patients would vent to me about this politician or this political situation or this or that. And, I treated everyone. I treated people that were always on different sides. And when I was in the room with them, it was about meeting them where they're at. And I became a blank slate. No opinion, just what are they dealing with and how can I help them where they're at? Because it's not going to do them any good if I argue with them or even if I agree with them. That's not going to actually help them fundamentally. What helps individuals most is a shift in perspective that moves them away from delusion and towards reality. And to your point, Andrew, when you were talking about leaders of organizations, and I agree with you that it's probably often, in most cases, more beneficial to not take a side. And you brought up, for example, unless you're the leader of a Palestinian or Israeli organization, but how much more powerful would it be if leaders in those organizations didn't automatically take a side and condemn the other, but instead brought a broader perspective that helped humanize the other side?
Mm, wow. Yeah, I didn't even think of that. Um,
And humanize both sides. Yeah.
Exactly.
remember,
And bring to it that view. And that doesn't necessarily mean humanizing the other side, as you demonstrated with the story of Arjuna. It doesn't mean that you don't then automatically not engage, but the way you engage can be different. It doesn't
right?
mean that there's no longer any fighting, but you can still see the other person as a human being who has their own suffering, their own hopes, their own joys. Yeah.
And I think that is such an important point, Thomas, of humanizing everyone, because the world we live in now, it continues to abstract us away from human connection, whether
Yeah.
that's through the internet, through AI, through how warfare is done with drones. And if you read history, you can read about ancient battles that happened where they would take a weekend off and like have lunch with each other, or allow the generals of the opposing side to walk through the lines back to their homes without being molested. Like, there we live in a time now where there's and I'm sure historically there were different times, perhaps in time with the yugas, where people were dehumanized. um, but the whole goal of propaganda for one side versus the other is to dehumanize the other side,
Yeah.
right? And so I think you're hitting that nail on the head of part of this goal of spiritual teachers is to humanize everyone. And I love that teaching of not responding to. Sometimes I think as spiritual teachers, we want to show our credentials. Yeah, I agree with you on this philosophical or political thing. I think really holding that role as a spiritual teacher of focusing on the teachings and helping people shift their consciousness. Both of you have said that so eloquently today. And I think that we live in a time where technology is changing the world so fast in an accelerated pattern, where the increase in experienced suffering and powerlessness will only grow, because of our ability to view things that are happening all over the world, and that helping people experience enlightenment is right now the most important thing that we can do, because it's what provides freedom um, internally, that to then make the important wise decisions that will need to be made to navigate this crazy time. um,
I think too, to your point about the technology, the age of technology, is that it's become harder for many people to listen well. And part of that has to do with the pace, the speed at which things happen. It's harder to get a full picture of the story of a human being and their experiences, what they went through, when you're getting just a quick reel of 10 seconds and that forms your opinion. One of the most profound uh, sort of moments that I've experienced over the last few years between the Palestinian and the Israeli conflicts was a social media platform called Clubhouse that I was part of for a little while. This was back in, I think, 2020, 2021, when there was, even then, there was some violence happening there. And there was a Palestinian and an Israeli who put together a room, what they call a room, where they would have conversations, shared stories between Palestinians and Israelis living in Israel, and what kinds of things they were told by their parents, what kinds of experiences did they have with each other and also separate from each other. And the facilitators were so brilliant and skillful at having listeners and people who are part of this community just listening to stories of human beings. It was rare, I think, in this sort of larger reality of social media and technology that happens so fast, to have the space. Thomas earlier talked about the liminal space. It was beautiful because it had that quality. We're all in this liminal space listening to each other's stories patiently. And yes, people were triggered. They would say things, but again, the facilitators were so skillful at calling out, nope, we're not going there. We're listening to a story. We're getting to know this human being in all of this complexity. That's what matters. So
Do you
listening.
remember do you know anything about who those facilitators were, or if they're still
I can
active?
let you know offline. I'd have to go back and look, but yeah, one of them I was communicating with on Clubhouse briefly, but this was like 3+ years ago. I'm not on the platform anymore, but
Yeah, I wonder what
no, it
happened to
was
that. It's kind of
yeah,
Twitter Spaces
it
no
was well
longer there.
done. It was, and I told him, through the messaging part, I said, this was really a very unique and a very important period of time when all the other rooms are just battling it out with the same old rhetoric. These people were creating unity, creating dialogue through shared experiences. So, amen to that, or soha, as we say in Vajrayana. Listening to stories and really deeply listening.
So hum. Well, fellas, what have we missed today? Is there anything, any dreg of wisdom that we didn't get to, or this might be a nice place to kind of wrap? But anyone have any closing thoughts, or anything that we had thought we might share that didn't get shared today?
Well, I really like the quote from Einstein that a problem cannot be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And I think that that speaks to a lot of the conflicts that we're having right now, is that these conflicts have been created by individuals and groups trying to impose their will on others. And it's not going to be solved by trying to impose our will on others. We have to find a different place from which to approach this, because otherwise it's just going to perpetuate the same thing. Yeah, on that note, I'll also just share a quote I have here from Thich Nhat Hanh. Peace must first be developed within an individual, and I believe that love, compassion, and altruism are the fundamental basis for peace. Once these qualities are developed within an individual, he or she is then able to create an atmosphere of peace and harmony. This atmosphere can be expanded and extended from the individual to his family, from the family to the community, and eventually to the whole world. And just like you mentioned earlier, Chris, about a bomb creates a ripple, peace also creates a ripple. And so when we create and bring that peaceful presence into our interactions, that will ripple out from us and affect change.
Hmm.
Oh, thank you.
Well said. Yeah.
That was beautiful. Guys, this was really fun. I think I can imagine that just the two of you having conversation with each other is so nourishing. I think that spiritual teachers, whether you're a yoga teacher, a Buddhist teacher, any tradition, having conversations with colleagues and friends on the path, it's just it creates illumination, it creates energy, it creates power. So I hope that anyone who listens to this will also be inspired by the same. And thank you, fellas, for being a part of this 18th episode of Dregs of Wisdom. Peace, peace, peace. We're going to call it
Peace,
out
peace,
there.
peace. Shanti, shanti, shanti.
Hey, if you like that, hit like and subscribe. Join us for the next Dregs.